You knocked me off, David.
Sorry.
Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Fabulous. So this is our homelessness allocations, what we can learn from Tenants Pulse report. And as David said, we are going to be recording. We are recording now, so if you don't want to be seen, please do turn off your camera. Comments can go in the comments box. If everybody knows where that is, it's either at the top of your screen saying chat or at the bottom of your screen. If you've got a burning desire to ask a question, please put it in there and I will try and catch it at the end. If not, we can ask questions at the end. Firstly, I'd like to thank Welsh Government and Pobl. We're part funded by Welsh Government, and Pobl sponsor us for Tenant Pulse. The questions for this report specifically were developed in collaboration with Welsh Government, and Welsh Government are in attendance today, so I don't know if anyone from Welsh Government would like to comment at this stage, but please feel free to come on the screen if you would like to say anything before we start. I didn't prepare you for that, so it's okay if you don't want to.
Hi, sorry, it's Gemma Smith here from Welsh Government. I'm really sorry, I can never get my camera to work with Zoom. It just doesn't like it, so I'm very sorry. But saying that, I've had a cold, so probably it's better you don't see me. Just a huge, massive thank you to TPAS and to all of the tenants who took part. We had an overwhelming response, and your voice is so important. So if I could just say at this stage, we are looking at quite a specific area, and we're thinking about homelessness, and we always think, well, that's a specific group of people, but it's not. Homelessness can happen to anyone. So your voices of your experiences in social housing and within the system already, it's just really important to feed in and to capture this. So thanks ever so much for the time. We appreciate it. We really do. Thank you.
Thanks, Gemma. So the findings of this report, as with every Tenant Pulse report, are based solely on the tenant voice. So it's not necessarily TPAS Cymru's specific policy position, it's yours as tenants. And we appreciate that there are other organisations out there carrying out extensive and admirable work for the homelessness problem that we have in Wales. And this report serves as the tenant voice response to the white paper proposals on ending homelessness. The majority of the questions, I don't know if I can say the majority, but it felt like the majority of the questions were qualitative analysis, so comments that we analysed. So here's my specific interpretation of the data. So who am I? If you don't know me already, I'm Elizabeth Taylor, the Policy Engagement Officer at TPAS Cymru. I've probably met most of you already, but just in case I haven't. So this is just a quick introduction to Tenant Pulse. It's a national platform for Wales that enables tenants to voice anonymous accounts. That's really important to note of their experiences and thoughts relating to their homes and their communities. We don't share any of your information, names, etc., email addresses, unless you have agreed for us to do that. It currently incorporates an annual survey, which I'm sure many of you paid part in, and the net zero survey, the energy efficiency, energy attitudes and net zero, which David was just mentioning at the beginning. We'll be releasing that one soon. And then there's also specific topics and surveys co-developed with stakeholders, housing policy influencers, such as Welsh Government, such as this specific Tenant Pulse report. And that tends to go to the Welsh Government to give insight into the next developments in policy. Sometimes there's a specific audience. For instance, that we might be doing specifically to the PRS, the private rental sector, or the specific to social housing sector, which this one was. So getting the report, it is now available on our website, www.tpascymru.com/pulse, and you are the first to be seeing the results. If you would like a copy sent to your email address, please do email inquiries@tpas.cymru, and we'll try and get one to you before the day's out. So why is this Tenant Pulse important, and all Tenant Pulse is so important? So this one was that the Welsh Government had launched a white paper that proposed significant changes to housing policy in Wales. and homelessness organisations did respond, but TPAS Cymru and Welsh Government wanted the wider tenant voice to be input into those policy discussions and at that national level. The promotion of the survey. So this time, in recent surveys, we've had to do paid advertisement, but this time we actually reached a really good amount of tenants just from going through membership platform. So we sent the pulse to over 1,000 tenants who are subscribed to our Tenant Pulse database, excluding the private sector. Also, social landlords and tenant groups supported it by sharing it on their own platforms, and some landlords contacted tenants directly to have them fill out the survey. So thank you to the landlords that are here who did that. A total of 662 social housing tenants from across every local authority in Wales responded to the survey. The highest responding areas were Rhondda and Taff, and the lowest was Monmouthshire. This is quite consistent, I think, with our previous tenant pulses, same areas. Usually if we've got a private sector pulse, it's Cardiff is the highest. And the highest representation across all age groups, but the lowest being 18 to 30, as we did not include the private sector and paid ads in the time frame that we had, and because we did get a great response rate. The majority of respondents had lived in social housing for over 5 years. We did have representation from the other groups, but the majority were in for over 5 years. We had from previous pulses, this was the highest representation from deaf or disabled individuals, and the other comment highlighted other underrepresented groups that we had not recognised, including neurodiverse and parent/orphan. We are unable to filter and report on all of the variables in this report, but if you have any data requests for certain segmentation, so for instance you're a specific housing association, local authority, tenant, that you would like to know more about a specific area or specific group, then please do let us know and we'll try and sort that for you. Key findings. So the majority of the survey, as I said, was open text, meaning there was an abundance of qualitative data, but the most prominent findings we've set out in these 2 slides. I'll present the first one and David will come in to present the second one. So the first one is accessibility for all. So the overarching belief throughout is that social housing should be accessible for all people, regardless of their income, of their background, and as housing is seen by tenants as a fundamental human necessity. The second one was that needs-based allocation. So priority for social housing should be given to those who are homeless or have medical issues or are living in unsuitable conditions. And one of these should not be deemed as more important than the other. So whilst you'll see in the findings that we had quite a high percentage of people agree that homelessness should go to the top of the priority list, people were quite cautious and adamant really that everybody should be seen to be given a chance. Special consideration for specific groups. So there's a recognition of the diverse needs of various groups, such as families, single parents, people experiencing domestic violence, ex-members of the armed forces, with calls from tenants for tailored support and assessment that are fit for purpose to consider that individuality. Individuality and individual assessment was the key theme going throughout. Removal from the housing waiting list. So the majority of respondents, particularly those from diverse ethnic backgrounds, disagreed with the removal from of individuals from a housing waiting list if they were not deemed to have that immediate housing need by local authorities. 5, so deprioritising those who manipulate the system. That was one of the questions which we'll more detail about. So that was the proposal, that should we deprioritise people who are manipulating the system, and the vast majority, so 86% of the respondents, supported deprioritising individuals who manipulate the housing system. Although this did vary amongst the demographics, with younger, newer social housing tenants and underrepresented groups showing slightly lower agreement with that. 46% of which identified as Black, Asian and minority ethnic agreed. And they also said they preferred this case-by-case approach due to the difficulty in providing the evidence for manipulation. So what does that mean, for example? Satisfaction with social housing upon moving in. So this was again another question around how people felt when they moved into their properties. So the majority, 67% of respondents, were satisfied with the good and safe standard of their social housing upon moving in. Those satisfaction levels did vary among demographics, like the previous question. So younger respondents and those from underrepresented groups reported lower satisfaction, while older individuals and those with less time in social housing were more satisfied. Regarding the addressing issues with their landlord and housing association, so that was another question around how do you I can't remember the exact question now. Have you been able essentially to report an issue comfortably and you're satisfied with that? And we'll go into that into more detail. Yeah. So those with less than 2 years tenure found it easier to have their issues addressed than other groups. Next finding, David.
So this isn't necessarily new findings, they're building on Elizabeth's, but I thought it was interesting just to take a pause on what she's just said, and I think summarize it in how I saw it in my brain, which was when we first asked people, you know, are you in favor of homelessness priority being the top priority? And people initially go 51%, only just, but 51 majority say yes. Yep, we're in favor of that. Let's make them the top priority. When the next question, you'll see as we go through this, the next question then says, okay, and that will mean though that other people might have to wait a bit longer and there might be more of an impact on other people. There was reversal in that opinion and it fell back to only a third, I think it wasn't even, just under a third, who actually then supported that proposal. And I think that's a really interesting bit, isn't it? About where do people's, when you start explaining consequences, you can't have a winner without a loser, you can't have people at the top without bringing down. There was a bit of a shift in, well, there was a significant shift in opinion there. And that's something I think we need to tackle as a sector. If we're going to change priorities, people need to understand the consequences. And I think there's a trust issue here as well, good and bad. We mentioned already, Elizabeth mentioned there was a majority support for removing people from the waiting list, you know, so if they had manipulated the system, as you see it on the bottom, but there was a motion for not removing people from the waiting list altogether. There's an argument, say Cardiff Council have got 15,000 people on their list. Then some of them are never going to get to the top because there's always people coming in, people moving in, things like that. So there's an argument we need to cull some of the waiting lists because there's people who just aren't a priority. There was a lack of trust on this. They didn't trust local authorities to do that, to make those decisions and make them in a fair and equitable way. I know that's really unfair on the people in charge of those things, but there was a lack of trust there to maybe cull those waiting lists and a lack of support for it. And I think also, as you know, homelessness and other challenges are complex. And we see there about young people leaving the care system. One of the proposals from Welsh Government was, should young people, you know, leaving the care system be created as a priority group? And there just wasn't that support there. I think there was the support for, well, I think other options need to be explored, or what else could the private sector do? What else is out there, rather than let's make them a priority group for social housing. So I don't know how you feel about that. We explore that later in the chat, but there's certainly a lack of trust, I think, in the system of this at the moment. Sorry, Elizabeth, I'll let you carry on.
Good. We'll explore like what David's just said in a little bit more detail. So thinking about the age representation, so we did have good representation from each of the age groups, apart from the 18 to 30, as we mentioned earlier. It was significantly lower, as you can see, 7%. I'm just short of 7%. We haven't ran a survey like this one before, so we were unable to draw comparisons from anything previously. It is lower compared to our PRS pulses, but that's because we get a lot of representation from Cardiff, PRS, higher representation from younger people. Based on the hello. Can you sort that, David, please? But based on the fact that this survey was specifically aimed at social housing tenants, the diversity in age range was really good. When we look at the underrepresented groups, we've broken it down, and those who identified as deaf and disabled, we had 47%, which again is quite consistent with previous tenant pulses. Black and ethnic minority groups, 5%, I think was definitely higher than previous. LGBTQ plus 11%, carer, going too fast, 23%. Gypsy, Roma or Irish traveller, 0.3%, and English or Welsh isn't my first language, we had 10%. So really good representation from underrepresented groups. We can always do better, but it was good representation for us. We asked tenants how many years they'd been living in social housing. As you can see, almost 75% of respondents have been living in social housing for over 5 years, with the majority, 39%, living in social housing for 15 years or more. Almost a quarter had been living in social housing for less than 5 years, which enabled us to compare some of those experiences. So again, this is reflective of the age groups, the age groups who responded. So what did the survey say? I can hear you all ask. So we asked tenants, what did we ask? Who do you believe social housing is for? And the themes that came out were, the first one, they thought it was for everyone. It should be accessible for everyone. This was, again, the most reoccurring theme throughout, is that belief that social housing should be for everyone, regardless of their income, their background, or any other factors. And again, the idea that housing is a basic human necessity that should be available was continuously emphasised. Secondly, that was around needs-based allocation. So they thought that social housing, the concept of a needs-based allocation, is incredibly important, where priority is given to those with the greatest need. What that actually means, need, was not specific. We couldn't really figure out what that meant, whether due to homelessness, medical issues, or unsuitable living conditions. So who determines that greatest need wasn't clear. Some suggested allocating housing based on the urgency and the severity of the individual's specific situation. And there was the emphasis on providing social housing for those on lower income. We then had social housing should be thinking about local connection and priority. So some respondents expressed the view that social housing should prioritise local residents or the local public, the local general public, somebody who is from Cardiff or from can't even think of any names of places in Wales right now, my head's just gone. Aberystwyth, someone specifically from Aberystwyth should be put in to get to stay in Aberystwyth. And the idea of prioritising those long waiting history was mentioned. So people who've been on the waiting list for so long and they're local, they should be prioritised. The fourth key theme was the specific consideration for specific groups and diverse needs. So there was a consistent mention of the specific needs of families, single parents, and those facing domestic abuse, and ex-members of the armed forces. They were all things that people raised specifically. And there was the acknowledgement that people have diverse needs and circumstances, with calls for individual assessments and common sense to be used to determine priority and urgency. And concerns about the potential misuse of the system, such as individuals falsely claiming homelessness to secure social housing, was also mentioned. Then there was the affordability and accessibility element. So a common theme was the idea that social housing should be available to those who can't afford to buy or rent in the private sector, since the private rental sector rents have increased so significantly. And tenants also emphasised that their concerns around rising property prices, unaffordable rents, and the challenges faced by those lower income families, and that they should receive priority. Critical evaluation of the system. So this was basically around the fact that they want all these things to be happening, but somebody they're not comfortable, tenants are not comfortable with housing allocations at the moment, and they're based that the current policy is based on historical factors rather than current needs, hence the white paper. So we asked tenants, do you agree or disagree that those experiencing homelessness should be given additional or greater priority for social housing? And they said yes initially. So this was what the 51%. So as David mentioned earlier, at a first glance, the majority, so 51%, agree that those experiencing homelessness should be given that additional or greater priority for social housing. And for those that felt otherwise, there were two key themes coming out. So they said that there was a need for an individualised approach. So phrases such as separate tailored support, each case on its own merit and depends on the circumstances, was emphasised, and the need for that individualised approach. This just kept coming out throughout, this individualised approach to addressing homelessness. And the idea that solutions and support should be customised based on that unique circumstance and reasons for each person becoming homeless in the first place. The second one was housing solutions and priority. So there was a recurrent theme relating to housing solutions, ranging from the need to build specific types of homes, example, single occupancy studio apartments, to discussions about prioritising certain groups. So then we asked further questions around whether people agreed or disagreed. So the first question, then we wanted to understand more, so we gave the opportunity to make comment. And there were 5 key themes which aligned with previous themes mentioned. So there was that contextual evaluation of homelessness. So many comments emphasised the need for a nuanced contextual evaluation of homelessness. There is also an acknowledgement that not all homeless situations are the same, and factors such as the reasons people became homeless, individual circumstances, and the potential for reoccurrence should also be considered. The idea that this one size fits all should be taken into consideration, as one size does not fit all, and we should approach each case individually. So the second one, challenges and support for those experiencing homelessness. The comments really highlighted the challenge faced by people who are currently experiencing homelessness, including mental health issues, trauma, and the lack of support. There was a consensus amongst the respondents that providing social housing is not the sole solution, that they need other things need to be included, such as additional support services are needed to help individuals to rebuild their lives. It's not just about homing them. And the theme emphasised a holistic approach to addressing homelessness, considering both immediate shelter and ongoing support so that they can sustain their tenancies. Priority and fairness. So people discussed in the comments the importance of fairness in allocating housing to those experiencing homelessness. Some argued for first come first serve systems, while others expressed concern about people abusing a system and misinterpreting as homelessness to gain priority. So saying that they're homeless just to gain priority. So how do they evidence that homelessness? And this theme revolved around the need for a fair and just system for allocating housing resources. Then there was the diverse needs and circumstances, again, consistent with previous themes. The comments highlighted the factors such as being a single parent, as I said before, having children in school, facing unsafe living conditions, and dealing with mental health issues. This theme really underscored the complexity of assessing, prioritising individuals based on their unique set of circumstances. And then there was the ethical considerations and compassion. So many of the comments reflected on the ethical considerations of prioritising housing for those experiencing homelessness. This compassion and empathy was running throughout, arguing that those who are experiencing homelessness are often in great need and should receive support. And the discussion touched on societal responsibility, humane treatment, and the potential positive impact that would have on public health and well-being. Are you still with us, everyone? Good. However, the next question changed tenant participation of the issue. This must be David. David? David's gone.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, there he is.
It's just all it is it's what we're talking about the next slide, that the people's perceptions changed. If you go to the next one, we asked people, this is the key question. Question 1 had said, do you support homelessness going as a key priority? And then the second question, this was the follow-up, and the wording for those who are interested in this is really important, I think. This is where the change occurred. Okay,
so to give higher priority to social housing for those experiencing homelessness, there may be an impact, slower access to social housing on others, such as, so basically they asked the question, but then they went into more, we asked the question, should I say, and then we went into more detail about what that would mean. So yeah, immediately people think, of course, people should be given priority if you're homeless, because that's an awful situation to be in. But then trying to understand what that would mean, things slightly changed. So people housed, so this is the impact, sorry. So people housed in insanitary or overcrowded housing, people with medical or welfare needs, including disability, and people who need to move to a particular locality to avoid hardship. So do you believe that by moving homelessness to the top of the priority list, and these other groups would go down the priority list, do you believe that that is acceptable, or an acceptable impact or an unacceptable impact? And they said, and 51% said an unacceptable impact. 33% almost said an acceptable impact, and 16% said that they weren't sure. They don't know. So you see what David was trying to say about it changes. Initially you think that, and then it changes when people understand the impact. So there were 3 current themes coming out of this when we were trying to understand what they meant. And they said that the housing system needed to be challenged. The tenants were calling for a rethink of the current housing system. There were concerns over including overcrowding and underoccupied accommodation, and the need for a more comprehensive support system, as well as the housing element. Then there was the importance of long-term solutions and preventative measures. So there was an emphasis on the need for long-term thinking, cost-effective solutions, and preventative measures to address the root causes of homelessness. And then there was the individualized support again, and the tailored solutions. So that, as I said before, common theme throughout. Respondents emphasised the need for this to consider all elements of homelessness. And for those that felt that placing homelessness at the top of the priority list would be, so how many people was that? So that's 33% almost that agreed. We tried to understand that, and 3 themes came out of that. So the 3 themes were number 1, the impact on health and well-being. So comments were highlighting the negative effects of homelessness on mental health and physical health, and that there was a consensus really about providing housing is not only a humanitarian act, but also contributes to reducing healthcare expenses and improving the overall well-being of individuals. That's why they agreed. Secondly, whilst there are differences of opinion within the sector, many emphasise that homelessness individuals should be prioritised, and however, many thought that specific factors should be at play when giving priority, such as the presence of children, health issues, or some reasons, specific reasons for homelessness. Some emphasise the need for a fair and just system to determine priority without abuse. Again, individual circumstances. So this talks about, again, children, whether children are present at the time, and also whether it was by choice, whether becoming homeless was by choice. So like, are there any presence of additional challenges like addiction, antisocial behaviour? And there was a call for a case evaluation rather than that one size fits all. So the question around young people we asked was, young people leaving the care system are currently not on the priority groups for social housing set in legislation. Do you agree that they should be added as a new priority group for housing so they would get faster access to social housing? And tenants said lots of different things. So 35% almost agreed that they should be added, 10% disagreed, and 52% said that other housing options need to be considered. So only those 35% of respondents agreed that young people should be added on, with neither, there were minimal comments explaining the answers around this, but those who did elaborate on this emphasised that there cannot be a block category for this specific group, and it needs to focus on the individual and in themselves. And when looking at the demographic of those responding to this question, there were no significant differences in responses from the 60+ group, the underrepresented group, the disability only group, and interestingly, the 18 to 30 group. So despite talking about young people, the 18 to 30 group didn't respond any differently. And the only significant difference came from those who identified as Black, Asian, minority ethnic, with 47% agreeing that young people leaving the care system should be added to the priority list. So they were the most in agreement for this. Then we talked about council housing priority lists. So currently many people are waiting on the housing lists and may never get allocated to social housing, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And the Welsh Government proposals say that if you are not viewed by the local authority as having a housing need, you may be removed from the waiting list. So we asked tenants, do you agree with this? Tenants told us that they disagree, majority disagree. So 63% disagree, 27% agree, and almost 10% stated otherwise. So trust was the key issue that came out of this. So they didn't trust the local authorities to cut the list down. And when we looked at the slight variations based on the demographics, 53% of aged 18 to 30 were disagreeing. 73% of those identified as Black, Asian and minority ethnic disagreed. That was the highest. And then 67% of over 60s disagreed. There is more detail in the report on the comments that came out of this, but they ultimately centred around fairness and transparency in decision making, individual circumstances again, and the complexity of prioritising social housing. So we asked, do you agree or disagree that if people manipulate the system to gain social housing, they should then be removed or moved down the list, And 86%, a significant majority of respondents agreed that manipulation of the system to gain social housing should lead to the consequence of deprioritisation. There was some variations based on the demographics of who agree with these proposals. So those aged 18 to 30, 75% of them agreed Those who have been living in social housing for less than 2 years, 78%. Underrepresented groups, 83%, 86% with those with a disability, and 46% of those identifying as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. And that was, as you can hear, the most statistically significant variation. And we explored it further to find out that they believe it should be a case by case. Those identifying as Black, Asian and minority ethnic believed it should be case by case approach because it's far too difficult to prove. And when we explored the comments to understand, whilst tenants agreed that they mentioned the importance of considering the desperation of people who might manipulate the system, and they may be taking desperate actions to taken by the individuals due to the lengthy waiting list and perceived lack of change in the system. So they might have been on the waiting list for a really long time. They're in a desperate set of circumstances and they've acted on manipulating the system, and that needs to be taken into consideration according to tenants. And then there was that fairness and accountability around evidence-based decision making. So there were concerns about the fairness of deprioritising or penalising individuals without proper consideration of their unique circumstances. There is more detail about that in the actual report. So we asked tenants, when you received your social housing accommodation, was the accommodation of a good and safe standard for you to occupy? And we had almost 67% of respondents were happy about the good and safe standard of their property when they moved in. There were variations in the demographics of who were happy. So 50% of age 18 to 30, 63% of underrepresented groups, 72% aged over 60, 57% of those identifying as Black, Asian and minority ethnic, and 72% of those who had lived in social housing for less than 2 years, which was in line. So we got the age 60 and those who had lived in social housing for less than 2 years were at the same, and the lowest happiness was from those identified as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. So then we asked, if there was an issue, were you able to raise these issues with your landlord in a straightforward way? Over half of the respondents, 52%, were able to raise the issue that they identified, but those issues haven't been dealt with. When looking further into that, those that had lived in social housing for under 2 years had found it easier to report the issue, with 40% raising the issue and having it dealt with. Respondents identifying as Black, Asian and minority ethnic had also found it easier than other demographic groups, with 33% stating that they were able to raise an issue easily and have it dealt with. Over 60s were the most unable to easily raise an issue. Initially, I'm guilty of assuming that this was relating to tech, but when looking into the qualitative data, it seemed that there was a misunderstanding with the question, and there was focus on the fact that when the concerns are raised, they are simply dismissed. So they have been raised, they've just not been dealt with, rather than not been able to raise them. There was a feeling amongst the respondents that their landlords didn't care amongst this group. We explored the comments from the other section within the report, and we broke it down further. So we asked tenants, generally, if you were to identify a fault, hazard or physical condition at your current accommodation which affected your safety and well-being, would you know how to report it? I can feel all the landlords in this room like, oh gosh, but fortunately we had a good result with that one. So 97% of respondents felt that they could and they would be able to report an issue in their home if they felt that it affected their safety and well-being. The only notable difference when looking at the demographic variations was those identifying as Black, Asian and minority ethnic with 100% stating yes, and those who had lived in social housing for less than 2 years, slightly lower with 88% stating yes. Final question, which I'm sure you're happy to hear, me waffling on in my northern accent. Whilst waiting for settled housing accommodation, have you ever had to decline or refuse an offer because it was not suitable for the needs of you and your households? Was there a consequence of doing so? So you're waiting for accommodation, so a tenant's waiting for accommodation. Have they had to refuse it for a specific reason? And was there a consequence of the refusal? So tenants told us the majority of respondents, 66%, had not been offered unsuitable accommodation. 20% had declined unsuitable accommodation without consequences, and 8% had declined with consequences. So when looking at the variations across the demographics, the two groups with the notable differences were those living in social housing for less than 2 years. Decline in unsuitable accommodation led to higher consequences than other groups, so 10% of them led to consequences. That being said, there were also within that group with the highest decline of unsuitable accommodation with no consequence, and respondents who identified as Black, Asian and minority ethnic had higher success rates with not being offered unsuitable accommodation, 7% higher than the overall. In the report you can see the breakdown of each demographic group. And to understand those consequences, we want to know if there was a consequence, what was that? We looked at the respondents' comments, which focused on a variety of things, including their reasons for not accepting the accommodation. And 4 key themes were identified. So there was the limiting housing options and pressure to accept unsuitable accommodation. So instances where individuals feel pressured to accept the accommodation that is unsuitable for their needs, and the consequences such as being moved down the waiting list or removed from it for refusing properties that are deemed unsuitable. And the lack of choice and support in the housing allocations process, leading to individuals feeling trapped in accepting less than ideal living conditions. Then there was the challenges in accessibility and adaptability. So issues relating to the accessibility and adaptability of the offered housing, especially for disabled respondents. Struggles to find properties that meet specific disability needs and the consequences of refusing unsuitable options. Frustrations over the lack of suitable housing options for individuals with mobility challenges and specific medical requirements. And then there was the geographical challenges and impacts on family ties. So this centered around the concerns over being offered accommodation that's far away from family, affecting the individual's ability to maintain relationships, support networks, jobs, and instances where geographical location of the offered property is a major factor in people refusing that accommodation. And the challenges in balancing housing needs with the proximity to family members and support systems. So going forward, if you are a tenant group or a landlord team and you want to discuss these findings further, please do let us know. You can either email me, elizabeth@tpass.cymru, or inquiries@tpass.cymru, or David, drw@tpass.cymru, and one of us will come back to you. Our request really from this is that you read and share the report with colleagues and tenant groups, discuss as a tenant group and use it to influence scrutiny subjects and tenant panels, share on your social media and watch our upcoming video on the summary, make others aware of it, and share the recording of this webinar available from the website probably next week. So this is what the report looks like. Thank you to each one of you and to our sponsors. Does anybody have any questions? Thanks for listening. Okay, where are we? We've got, I feel like I saw something in the chat and now we can see the chat.
The comments, I've put the link to it. I had a private message about just they'd missed the total number of responders at the beginning. I've answered that to the person. Yes, Steve Porter. I don't know if Steve, you want to repeat your question and see if anyone's got any views on it.
Yeah, I was just interested in about the individual aspect that people were interested in, about coming up with an allocations policy and allocation properties which tailor to people's needs a bit more.
Yeah.
And I just have this feeling with choice-based lettings that you're sort of just lumping people into one particular category, and there isn't that flex in the system very much, and kind of flies in the face of that a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, a second aspect of it. Sorry,
the
second aspect was about the time-based element, and there didn't seem to be much focus on the time spent in housing need, which is great from our perspective because we're looking at our allocations policy at the moment, and we've sort of taken that out a little bit. We're trying to, and it didn't come. It sort of supported that really, that there was no too much emphasis on time.
Yeah, I can't answer in too much detail, Steve, myself. When I read some of the comments on it, the young care, leaving care was a great example where people were like, yeah, we get that they need to be prioritized, but is there any other options rather than that blank allocation, a blank blocking of this section's more important than this section and this. And I think there was a lot of sympathy from tenants for individual needs, individual consideration of how they've ended up like that, if I'm truthful, because we don't always put all the comments in there in the full report, there were certainly people who were uneasy about homelessness this is not us, by the way, this is just comments from tenants saying, if it had been their fault, I don't think anyone's fault at homelessness, but that sort of perception of drugs, why would they be priority over a young mother with family with damp and mold, desperately need rehousing? And I think that's where that individual needs, I think there was a lot more sympathy for tenants for that than maybe block allocations that we try and achieve to make it more transparent, But trust was the issue. There wasn't a great deal of trust, like say removing people from the list. We know, I know a lot of people on the list are never going to get to the top, and they should be removed. But there wasn't that. Who makes that call? Who makes that decision? I don't know if that answers your question. And anybody else? I know, Kevin, there's other people commenting here. Amy.
I think it kind of highlights throughout that this is bigger than changing homelessness legislation. It's about the whole allocations process and the whole of housing policy, and how we look at that from an individualized perspective, which is probably not that easy done. We've got lots of people in Wales in social housing, but I think it's just taking this report away, reading it and thinking about how you can take those factors and put them into your own allocation policy, the things that people are saying. And Steve, if you want to talk about this afterwards, about how we can look at it in more depth, maybe from people in your area, then please do drop me a message.
Yeah, thanks. I will do. And what's interesting was that homelessness aspect of it in only 50% and then down to 30%. And I think the Welsh Government need to take note of that in terms of the white paper, because I think for me the white paper definitely has a huge focus on homelessness and getting people housed through homelessness. And I think potentially that drives people to be homeless and also alienates tenants a little bit and stops tenant mobility. So we have to be really careful in designing allocations policies that we get the right balance. And so the views that have come across probably the Welsh Government should take note of, I think.
Welsh Government have received the report. They were instrumental in doing this in the first place. I don't know if anybody from Welsh Government wants to come in and make comment on that.
Oh, sorry. Hiya. Sorry, I'm really bad at unmuting. So sorry. No, these are really valid, and these voices are what we didn't want to miss out on. So it's been really, really helpful. And just to flag as well, what's been really helpful to hear today and to see as part of this response is that people have been very clear that it's an individual at the end of this. That's become very clear through the responses. And so just to stress there that we've asked this group in particular to look at the access to housing section of the white paper. That's where we targeted. The white paper is huge. It looks at homelessness as a whole. So what was really key there, though, and what's really interesting and helpful for us is knowing that you want this individual approach, because within the wider context of the proposals, we have things like proposals for personal housing plans for people going through the system, wider duties on other support providers. So it's not just our housing and homelessness teams and local authorities having to deal with this. Housing alone doesn't solve the issue. We need health to speak to us and take a role. We need education. We need these groups to all come together. So this is really key for the wider findings as well. In relation to what the responses here today, I know that TPAS are going to send over recommendations as a result of this. So those, of course, will form and feed into our consultation response. But yeah, and again, just to know, thanks ever so much for the responses that have been received.
I also think, sorry, that we could do follow up if there's certain sections. So I've mentioned more than once now in this session the one about culling the homeless list, the waiting lists. People weren't given a choice as to how that was going to happen, so they were rightly concerned about that. Now, if there are proposals developed by Welsh Government or local authorities as to how you might cull, or I know they're going to hate the word cull, shorten the list or do something about the waiting lists. If there are proposals, and to do it in a fair and equitable way that's transparent and things like that, I'm sure we'd love to work with local authorities, maybe locally, on how they consult on that and get that trust level, because the trust isn't there at the moment, but it doesn't need to say it can't be there if we were a bit more open and honest about, more transparent about how that could work. Sorry, I did that badly, but I think hopefully you know what I mean.
Waiting list is an excellent reflection on housing.
Yeah.
Dave, and Elizabeth, Paul put up his hand a minute
Sorry,
ago.
Paul.
Yeah, no worries. A couple of things that sort of jump out for me. Obviously, the trust and the local authorities with the allocations list. Obviously, one of the things that we do here in Ceredigion, the council doesn't have housing, but it has the housing allocation list and a housing allocation policy. And then it interacts with the social landlords here on the policy when it's up for review. And as a tenants group, we're actually involved in that. So we're able to also put a tenant's perspective forward about any changes to the actual allocation policy and how it can also adversely affect tenants, etc. So that may be another thing looking to be looked at to try and ease that mistrust. Or maybe local authorities should be consulting with the wider community when they're looking at the housing allocation policy to sort of gain that insight. I think from another thing for me as well, I can't help but feel that a lot of demand on the actual housing allocations is due to the lack of what we would say, affordable rents as well. I feel that the Welsh government should actually start looking again through the social housing sector, actually having intermediate rents, because I believe that the way forward at the moment, or the current direction, is shared to ownership or shared ownership at the moment, or simple build social housing, because the rent to own, rent to buy scheme finished. So I think there's still a need now to revisit intermediate rents, because of obviously the private rental sector rent and market prices. But I think with local authorities, if they want to build that trust in their allocation process, then they need to engage more widely when looking at their policy.
Well, that's a really good point, actually. Really good point. And I hope that you can all take this report away, and when you are looking at your allocations policies, you can use this report to inform that development, because it is all tenant views. So if it's you're struggling with your own consultations, etc., that's what this is here for, and we're happy to work with you to do that. I would be very keen to know how you get, if you aren't involving us in it specifically, how you are using the report and how it may have made any changes, just so we can monitor that as well. Are there any final questions before we close? No? Well, we managed to do that in the hour. I'm very impressed. So thank you all so much for being here today, and the report will be live on our website now.
It is.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
I'll stop
Bye.
the recording. Those who are desperate for the recording, it'll be up in about 2 hours, something like that.